Before we begin, thank you very much to Josh A. for joining the Patreon campaign. Thank you very much for the support. Thank you, everyone, for the support. Even if it's $1 or $2 a month, it keeps the lights on, keeps the daily content coming. Really appreciate it. This is like day 6 in a row, and I swear, if I have to keep track of counting up a shout-out streak and counting down to the 1,000th video next month, I might lose track of numbers. I went to public school, don't blame me. So, you saw that for this month, for the year, rather, for this year, because it is the 40th anniversary, I am going through and doing a top 10 list of every toy for every year. So, right now, if you have not been keeping up with that series, we are right in the middle of the early 90s, which I know that phrasing doesn't make sense, hear me out. We're almost at the first year of Generation 2. We're at 1993. And that puts me in a little bit of a spot. So, to this point, the only things on that list have been brand new toys to that year. So it kind of puts me in a bind when we get to 1993, and most of the really good toys are repainted from the original G1 series. So I was kind of toiling, do I break the rule to actually include like what the best toys in general were for that year, or do I just reward the brand new stuff and kind of keep to that structure? So here's what I've ultimately decided. I am going to stick to the structure because it's not fair of me to, it's not fair. Later on, it's going to be really not fair of me to include repaints in what the best toys of the year are. And even with like the current modern day ones I do, I try to stick to molds that came out that year, not repaints. So I'm going to keep that mentality. However, just to cover all bases, and just so we can get some discussion about it in, I am doing a video today about the Generation 2 repaints. I honestly feel like there is a certain stigma to them that is kind of unfair. So, like, we take a look at Optimus Prime here, and Prime really kind of exemplifies what the G2 repaints were doing. They were either, like Prime himself, barely different and almost unnoticeable from the original, or they were like his trailer, wildly different. There's very few in-betweens when it comes to Generation 2 repaints. But all that said, what we think of with Generation 2 is like bright, loud 90s colors, and the truth is, not really. When you actually go back and look at it, not really. I mean, let's start small. We're going to start small here with the mini-bots, and that, of course, brings us to Bumblebee. Also, by the way, Sabertron, thank you very much for some of the photos in this video, because there's not many people willing to take photos of G2 toys, as it turns out. However, taking a look at a gorgeous Bumblebee here, yeah, the mini-bots just decided chrome. We're just going to do chrome. And you know what? On a mini-bot, that actually isn't a bad idea, because there's very few parts moving around on a mini-bot engineering. There's no risk, really, of parts clashing or scratching against each other. For the most part, the chrome should be fine, you know, and it should look perfectly okay. And yes, and then we end up like this, like little trophy Bumblebee, you know, or what would look like Lucky Draw Bumblebee. It's kind of cool knowing that a little gold Bumblebee exists who isn't actually Goldbug. So you had ones like that, and then you had Beachcomber. Okay, now we see the G2. Orange and green, trying to make orange and green mixed together is very much Generation 2, the way we perceive it. To be truthful with you, though, it's not a bad-looking color scheme. The fact that his body's completely gray actually does kind of mute it down quite a bit. But this is the dichotomy that I'm talking about. Like, they're either wildly different, or they are basically the same, you know? Like, there's not a whole... Like, okay, Bumblebee's like bright gold now, but that's basically just shiny yellow. You know, if you know the technicality there. Don't pick on me on it. And then you have things like this, where if this Beachcomber had happened in the mid 2000s, they would have given him a completely new name and made him a new character. So that's where it kind of gets in. And to be honest, they did do some weird stuff too. Like, for instance, Cliff Jumper here. Oh, wait, I mean Hubcap. This is Hubcap. They decided to do Hubcap instead of Cliff Jumper, and then they made him red. But he's still Hubcap. And yet he's red, and he's... That's where I start getting cross-eyed, and that's where we need to move on to other toys that are less complicated to talk about. Like this one. Talk about uncomplicated. So... we're moving up to the Autobot cars now, and yeah, I don't know why they didn't do anything to Inferno, other than, like, it's still a fire truck, and no matter what, a red fire truck is still going to be the color that any kid in the US or most parts of the world are going to expect when they think of fire truck. You know, that's just the iconic color of the vehicle. That said, even the robot mode really isn't changed. It's basically a reissue of the original Inferno with some tampagraphs added and, you know, to replace a few Autobot stickers. Now, the only big change, of course, is he's got a giant water thing on top of him now, because now he's got a water gimmick, because fire truck. So yeah, things like that. If you wanted to just have the original toy, well, 1993, you could potentially just find an Inferno that was basically just G1 Inferno. Or you might find a Jazz. And Jazz is an interesting dichotomy. So on a base level, he's essentially the same as the original. He's working the exact same color scheme. The plastic itself is exactly the same. But you do have the new deco. You have the new stickers, which are very musically themed. Rather than his original racing ones. And okay, that kind of meshes with Jazz's character. But again, you kind of see he doesn't look all that different. You can tell it's not G1 Jazz, but he's not going out of his way to be like 90s extreme with his color scheme, right? His wave mate, on the other hand. So again, drastically different. This is where we start getting into like G2 neon cliche, right? This is where people start associating G2 with neon stuff, right? So the reality of this, like the reality of what's going on here, is that we've got a Sideswipe who swapped his colors. So instead of black, it's red. Instead of red, it's black. What you get is a much edgier looking version of Sideswipe. And then you mix in some bright neon green stickers, his new weapon in the same bright neon green, neon blue for the missile for some reason. Okay, yeah. Okay, now I get to see where your 90s is. Now I get to see where the stigma of G2 neon comes from. But really, it's an accent color on what is essentially an inverted color scheme on Sideswipe. So in a way, it's not terribly far from the original, but also it does look, again, drastically different. You know, this would have been a new character in the mid-2000s level of different. But it's an interesting one, because it is doing something that should just make it look like Sideswipe, and then they just do something else. It's neat. It's neat. I think there's a reason why this is stuck around, and why it's a must-have Sideswipe repaint, because it's just interesting. What is not interesting is Starscream. Once again, barely changed. So we've got some gray parts now instead of all white jet parts. It's a little dull. We've got a blue cockpit canopy instead of the yellow. Meh, whatever. The biggest change is the stickering to the wings, which instead of just the standard stripes and Decepticon symbol, most of the wing is now covered by a camouflage deco. A camouflage deco that doesn't apply to any other part of the vehicle, which really makes you wonder how he thinks he's camouflaged. You're still wearing bright red. I'm pretty sure if you're flying in the sky, they're going to notice the bright red going through the clouds. This is mostly one where, you know, again, like Inferno, you know, and like Bumblebee in a way, they know the iconography of the character. They're not going to make him look terribly different, because they know if it looks like Starscream, it will sell. So he has to remain at least red and white. You can play around with the rest of it. We would see that in the Unicron trilogy. But as long as he's mostly red and white or off-white, you know, bordering on gray. He's still going to be Starscream. You're still going to sell him. No problem. No problem. You know, we can't, he's a very well-known character. We can't make him look that different. Hello, Ramjet. How you doing? So, like Starscream, Ramjet does go through a few physical changes. He's got brand new missile launchers, the same one Starscream has. He also has a new sound box because electronic gimmicks. This again. Like, I wouldn't call it neon because like the blue is kind of bright, but everything else is very subdued. Like, this is actually a pretty dark color scheme and far darker than the original Ramjet, who's mostly bright white. You know. So it's a drastically different color scheme. Might have given rise to Slipstream, except that's not the claim. Well, I've always been dubious of Derek's original explanation of like being based on Mega and Giga. No, this just looks like G1 Slipstream when you really look at it. But it is one of those, like, again, Starscream barely changed. Ramjet, drastically different. And that's kind of how G2 rolls. And again, there are bright elements to it, but I wouldn't call it the neon the way people like to make fun of. Here's an interesting batch. This one was super weird. So, if you got in early on your G2 Dinobots, you could have found them in their original gray color scheme. You could have found them in the original silver color scheme. That, you know, the only difference would have been the G2 Autobot tampograph they would have put on the toy. Here, the more well-known G2 Grimlock is blue. That's the one I had. That's the one most kids in the 90s picked up because that was the most common one. But aside from the original silver color scheme and the more common blue, you could also find him in turquoise. There was a turquoise Grimlock, which barely anyone ever brings up now. So, 3 different versions. Keep in mind, G2 Dinobots are already weird because it's Grimlock, Slag, and Snarl? Not Sludge, who was the other of the original 3 Dinobots. And they never did a G2 Sludge or a Swoop. There's concept art, but they never actually came to light. Weird choice to run the 3 of the molds in 3 colors, but completely snub the other 2. Kind of weird. And they did concept art, so I assume the molds were available at the time, right? They had to have been, if they were planning the release in any way, shape, or form. But speaking of Slag and Sludge, or Slag and Snarl, they did something weird too. So, Snarl, for instance, was most commonly found in his all-red color scheme. However, that extra red, the one that's the red that's not making up his torso, you could have also found that in green as his rare variant. And then, of course, that means Slag, who was normally found in green and looking very Christmassy while he did it, could be found in solid red as well. Weird, right? Really weird. You would think at the very least, if they were going to go a route like that, that they would make the Dinobots match, and that like Grimlock wouldn't stand out as blue against his red or green brethren. But there you go. I guess they just wanted to diversify their dinos. I had the red Snarl. It's a little bit special to me. And I also just kind of like that it's still kind of in that tone of the original Dinobots. It doesn't go too far. Again, he doesn't go very far. Now, I think a lot of the neon things come from like the Euro G1s that came over during Generation 2. Like the late Euro G1s. My boy, for instance, Rapido. Yes, he's got some neon going on to him. But in the US, they subdued it. And these do count as repaints, technically. They all came out in the same year, so we can talk about these during the best of 1993. But the ones that came from Europe all had pink windows over there and got these like translucent black windows in the US. So they subdued what we would have known as the G2 neon-ness of these toys. And, you know, probably, I think, maybe, honestly, maybe for the better. Maybe for the better. So I tend to like the ones with the black windshields more than I do the pink ones. Just how, you know, just my personal preference. But yeah, even the Euro G ones could, even like the Euro G ones that came over for G2, could not escape a little bit of repainting. So just to make sure those were included, I included them. I know you don't, I know you think mostly of normal, like year 1 and 2 repaints when you think of G2 repaints, but we got to include them. It's only fair. We will get back on the track though, because now we got to talk combiners. I think this is where most of the infamy comes from. So starting with the Constructicons, again, not really a whole lot different. In a weird way, you can say all they did was lose the blue from their original color scheme, because now, instead of green and purple, they are yellow and purple. Or orange and purple if you got the KB Toy versions. But the yellow one is the most common one, and honestly, it's fine. It's fine. If anything, yellow construction vehicles are far more common than bright neon green ones, so this, if anything, just kind of made them a more realistic set. I mean, we got Tonkanator, which is still like the dumbest crossover they ever did, but it basically just looked like G2 Devastator. You know, essentially, just a big yellow guy with yellow construction vehicles. So this really, again, I wouldn't define as like it's very noticeably different, but I wouldn't call it that different. You know, you're just kind of shifting his hue a little bit. It's not like Onslaught, who went from dark blues and grays and military tones to whatever this is. I've talked about this at length. I don't know where he thinks he's camouflaged, you know, a Lakers game, like a nuclear waste site. It doesn't matter. The Combaticons in general, they had the unifying thing in their color scheme of purple camouflage deco, no matter what color they were. So you'd get red with purple, you would get yellow with purple, you would get white with purple, and none of it looked like it could actually camouflage anywhere. It just kind of looked ridiculous. But then you had Vortex. And I really, really like G2 Vortex. I think the purple and blue looks really, really nice. And I think it might actually be conceivably good, you know, camouflage if this is like flying in the clouds at night. This might actually trick a few eyes. Just looks good. Just looks good, you know? It actually makes that weird decision behind the Combaticons nice. Inversely, the aerial bots got something really interesting. So, Skydive here. I believe it's Skydive. I can never really remember. I can never really tell them all apart. But point being, the G2 aerial bots kind of went with a stunt show theme. So they had deco on them, but for the, you know, on their stickers, it was a little bit more extreme. But for the most part, they just kind of looked good. Like, yes, there's one that's all gold plastic. Aside from being, you know, incredibly breakable, still looked okay. Still looked nice. But for the most part, they still look like real vehicles. They still look like real jets. You know, and this silver and blue combination, this is pretty. This is a pretty aerial bot. I like you. I like you. What happened to your leader? What happened to your leader? Where did he get the bright red and blue? Where did that come from? And yes, you can see my camcorder back there when I film reviews. This was taken in the shop because we actually have one in stock, weirdly enough. Hi. Why red? Why red and blue? Weird. So, yeah, the leader came out on the weird end on that one. Again, drastically different looking. But again, through all of these different examples, how much real neon did you see? We go out of our way to like pick on G2 over having like bright 90s color schemes, but the reality is not really. Not nearly so much. Not as much as we think. You know, there might be some original molds. We might be talking about that tomorrow when we do the top 10 of 1993. But for the most part, I think it gets a bad rap. You know, oddly enough, I think a lot of that reputation comes from stuff that never technically came out. Because if I'm going to classify neon characters, that is absolutely the G2 Stunticons. You know, Breakdown in his bright, like, teal and pink colors, that's G2 Neon. You know, Dead End in super bright yellow, that's G2 Neon. Or is that Wild Rider? I can never remember. I think it's Wild Rider. I think bright Dead End's the red one. Whatever. Still bright neon. Then yeah, Motormaster himself. He's got the ramjet thing going on, but in brighter shades. So again, like drastic shifts in design, drastic shifts in coloring, but these are where your neon colors come from. And I think because their legacy with collectors is so infamous and strong, I think this is why we have such a perception of G2 being all about the neon, because of things like this, that technically none of us ever owned. It's weird how that happens. Remember, the G2 Stunticons are so infamous, so popular amongst the original fandom, that not only did Hasbro do a full box set of the modern ones, not only are they in the middle of releasing brand new iterations of them from the legacy molds, but where is my G2 Defensor? You never heard that one come up, have you? I mean, it's the exact same rarity, exact same situation, but one gets it, one doesn't. That's because this one is so well known and so infamous amongst the collectors in the online community. And I think that's where we kind of get our colors skewed. You know, when we see things like this, we have this toy at the shop too, the Last Knight Primus. And this is popularly known in the fandom as G2 Primus because bright neon. But really, no, I think it's a bad rap. I really think it's just a bad rap. If you want neon, you go Euro G1. I mean, that's where your neon color schemes really shine. That's where you really go to get some real good neon. I think they calmed down a lot more for G2 than a lot of people give it credit for. If we're talking about favorites, you know, if we're just talking about favorites overall, because this is supposed to be a supplemental to the best of 1993, 94, however long we have to talk about these, then yeah, I'm probably going to be thinking about the G2 Snarl, the G2 Ramjet, the G2 Skydive, really pretty. Probably Sideswipe, and to round it off, let's see, honestly, probably Breakdown. I actually kind of like the teal and pink, kind of works. So, there you go. So, that's a quick list of favorites and a general overview of the repainting in G2. And yeah, I think we're being unfair. It's not nearly as 90s extreme as people really want to give it credit for. It's fine. It's just them trying something a little bit different, a little bit new, trying to freshen up some old toys. So, with those out of the way, tomorrow I'll be doing the best of 1993. We'll be discussing brand new molds for that year only. And it's going to be interesting because, like the earlier G1 years, there's not a whole lot of molds to talk about. So we're going to end up talking about some interesting toys. But that's what's on the docket. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.